in an enabling power of technology, of transforming economies, of creating jobs, and of boosting growth through the transition to a more sustainable environment. And I think for business leaders and policymakers, we can work together to define and shape the economy to benefit all of us who are in it. And again, I think again and again, it comes down to collaboration, because that's what it's going to take from all of us. And so accordingly, I invite all of you today to share with us your ambitions, your frustrations, your true experiences with respect to this whole process that we are undergoing of ensuring that we can embark on climate change so that we can learn from each other and achieve the goal that we all need to achieve for the world that we want to see. Thank you.
So much, Phuthi. And good afternoon to everybody. I'm Shamila from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and I have the unenviable task of moderating the roundtable today, but I'm so excited by seeing such a great collection of people. And thank you to Pragya, Phuthi and team for actually conceiving of this. I think it's a great conversation to have. Just for those of you sort of, inquisitive or curious about this gathering, we're looking at groupings of investors, of companies that are actually operating with these economies, and a regulatory context as well. And we know from what Phuthi said that it's going to be the bringing together of these different perspectives that is going to advance action on the climate agenda. Each of us is going to have a role to play. And so the conversation about that is critical. Now, today's panel is titled Just and Fair Climate Action. So of course, I think already you can see the nuances are really looking at more for Global South and how do we get that action going? What are the nuances that affect us in particular? And I think Naspers is very well positioned to be able to lead that because of your investments across the globe, including significant ones in the Global South, and how you as a company need to traverse that and this massive ecosystem that you actually engage with. So I think those perspectives are going to be really helpful to us. So Pragya, I actually want to kick off with you to give us some of those perspectives from you as an investor. So today I want you to wear your investor hat and where you're investing in different economies, particularly emerging market, Global South, what that's looking like and how that's affecting you as a company from, having this kind of Northern Hemisphere basis, but then setting targets and having to take action with companies based in a very different context. I'm going to hand over to some of that investor perspective, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, all of you, for being here. I'm going to start with a quick sharing. We just submitted, as of now, our science-based targets for the group for verification to be verified by 23rd of June.
We're watching the
we
media.
Hope to fast track that.
We're watching the media, Pragya. You said it now.
Yes, it is submitted. But no, thank you. So from an investor perspective, and we are a
closer.
From an investor perspective, it is when we set targets, it's meaningless if our companies are not able to get onto the trajectory of setting targets, because we set a portfolio coverage approach, and the target that we set for ourselves was 50% of our portfolio of businesses would have set a target for themselves by 2030. We of course hope that we'll be more ambitious and that it'll be we have a better end performance than that. But all of our underlying businesses, majority of our portfolio is based in the Global South. So when we ask these companies to set targets and for them to realize or even think about a decarbonization pathway, it's almost impossible to decouple that from the country level ambition where they're operating in that context. So what we've really come to understand and be a bit challenged by is the fact that whether it's a food delivery business that needs to transfer its fleet to decarbonize to electric vehicles, it's going to be a completely different trajectory if for Mr. D based in South Africa to Delivery Hero with your businesses across multiple countries to Swiggy that's based in India. Because South Africa has a 2050 target, India has a 2070 target, the energy mix looks different, the cost of capitalization for the country is different. So the capital inflow for financing that transition is going to be different. So those are the challenges that we're kind of dealing with and trying to, there is no one size fits all approach. However, there's a 1.5 degree trajectory, one size fits all approach that is being recommended for every company, regardless of its operating jurisdictions. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and how we can actually make it practical and an actual reality to support the companies without becoming a burden on them. and setting them up for failure.
Thank you, Pragya. And then sticking with a bit of an investor perspective, Yumna, I'm going to move over to you. A bit of an asset manager perspective, Schroeder is looking at that. And when you look at that, looking at ESG engagement within an asset management perspective, also over multiple jurisdictions, how does that impact you and your decision making? And what would your kind of reflections be, particularly on this north-south balance?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think our challenges are quite similar to what Pragna just mentioned. I would say that at Schroders, we take a very nuanced approach. So Schroders has an extensive engagement program across a number of different themes. I work on climate engagement. We have a program this year of engaging with 600 of our portfolio companies. And this is part of a wider engagement program across the next couple of years. In order to, just as Pragna mentioned, to decarbonize our portfolio also. So one thing that we've been really looking into quite recently is how do we apply the Just Transition framework when doing the engagement? And so, of course, we hold a number of companies across multiple different regions, but when looking at emerging market companies, we have holdings in South Africa across a number of different regions. It's definitely not easy and we're still learning, but I feel we're definitely taking a nuanced approach in terms of really understanding the different sectors, the different challenges they're facing. For example, if it's a mining company based in Australia, but has mines operating in South Africa, how do we deal with that? And so we've been asking companies questions like, how are you thinking about the social aspects of the transition as part of your decarbonization pathway? As part of your strategy, are you thinking about the local communities, the employment, asking those important questions? And we're trying to encourage that a lot more, and not just to the mining sector, but across all of them, if that makes sense. And I think I wouldn't say it's new, but it's something that we're getting up to speed with a lot more, and recognizing that it's an absolute challenge and something that's incredibly important. And there is no one size fits all approach, even though we're all trying to achieve that 1.5 target in the end. And so I think having that nuanced approach, really analyzing the different sectors and the regions that they're based in, and then having conversations with the companies in that way is the best approach to take. Otherwise, there is absolutely no way you can speak to a company based in China and ask them to take different steps, and they just look at you like, it's not going to happen. It's not realistic. So yeah, that's.
Thanks, Yumna. So I think that not a one size fits all is a bit of a relief, I have to say. And the acknowledgement that that's coming through on the asset management side and is going to be critical. I'm certain it's not going to be easy. Pragya's talking about, when we talk about net zero, it's average, right? Which means net is some above and some below. And so that acknowledgement is something I think we need to pay particular attention to. But it sounds to me like the key part is actually having the plan and saying, how are you going to get there? And then there's some clarity on that, which then guides the companies. So I think let's move a bit from an investor perspective to an operator perspective. So you've got companies that are working in different markets and jurisdictions. And who can I pick on first? I think, Jeff, I'm going to pick on you from Delivery Hero. And looking at, you're spanning multiple geographies, right?
Yeah.
So how do you manage for differences in those contexts as an operator? And that can't be easy, absolutely. And if you can give us a sense of that, and if they're critical enabling ecosystems for you on this drive and this journey, and how would you do that? And suppose maybe leading on from that investor perspective, if you have any reflections on engaging with investors from your perspective, a lot there, but I know you'll get it.
I'll try to cover as much of that as I can. But yeah, so Delivery Hero operates in over 70 markets, and we're a tech delivery company. We provide a marketplace that connects customers with local restaurants and shops, and then facilitate that delivery. And yeah, in operating across so many countries, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because in one sense, to your point, Prachna, is that while we have to consider the individual context of those markets for setting targets, we also know that we have a lot of different opportunities across the markets to be able to achieve those targets. And I think in that sense, a lot of what will drive our target will be driven more by the orders that we have within different countries than the different countries that we have. So for example, based on our analysis of our scope 3, over 50% of our emissions are driven only by the orders. So for us to achieve a science-based target, we have to decouple our order growth from our emissions growth. And that's really achieved by two drivers: packaging and then the emissions from the transport. And each of those, you can have common solutions like sustainable packaging that can be scaled across different markets, but then you have that individual market context that will need different packaging types to cater to the different types of restaurant vendors. And that was the learning that we had. So we piloted a sustainable packaging program and found, we tried to scale it with a small number of packaging units. And then we found the feedback from the restaurants in Hong Kong was widely different from the feedback from restaurants in Europe. So that was something that we then had to take into consideration to look at how do we really scale? We scale by going local.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we're pivoting that program into, to looking into those individual contexts. And coming back to the investor question, I think one of the most common questions that I get asked from investors is, do you have a science-based target? If not, when are you going to have a science-based target? And we haven't fully submitted it yet. We do have a climate action strategy that is approved. We are in the SBT process. I'm looking forward to being able to submit it. We just need to re-baseline first on the recent acquisition, but we aren't waiting until we get that signed off. We're already starting to implement that. And I think maybe just one final thing in terms of the individual context across markets is, while we have a group level target, the way that we try to make that manageable is breaking it down on a regional brand level. And so we tie the targets, or we're trying to tie the targets to the reality that exists within those markets. It's, we're not going to be setting an electric vehicle transition plan at the same level in some of our markets that we would say in our Nordic markets, because the infrastructure is just going to be fundamentally different.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm just going to ask a quick follow-on question. So the investors that are asking for the SBTs, where are they coming from? Just, geographically, or where are those investors based?
I would say predominantly European.
Yeah.
An increasing number coming from North America, from the US, but I would say still the majority of those asking the questions are European.
European, okay. And I'll come back to that when we have the regulator discussion later on. So Kip, I'm going to move to you quickly. And very exciting company based in Africa, Safaricom. Similar sort of question, right? In your sense, in your spanning different geographies, how are you looking at this? How's this impacting you? And the challenges, I suppose, operating in your context, perhaps even looking at trying to set science-based targets, manage the difficulties of operating in this kind of context in Africa, but having to also meet investor needs. Maybe give us a perspective on that.
Thank you very much. So I'm from Safaricom, which is out of Kenya, but we also have operations in Ethiopia. We're a telco company that's looking to move into becoming a technology company. There's quite a bit that we do around technology. The challenge is obviously that we have, and probably I'll start by saying, we already have a science-based target, but this was done in 2017. So thank you. And we see ourselves as very strong evangelists for countries, not just in our backyard, but in the continent, to make sure that they understand what this journey is all about. And so for us, setting that science-based target after getting our baseline was really crucial, because then you need to know sort of where you're at. On that basis, therefore, then we've set a target for us to be carbon neutral by 2050. I reckon that before we get to that target, we'll sort of be moving into a more aggressive space of saying we want to be net positive, so that we're not waiting to get there by 2050. And on that basis, then we set certain incremental targets, 2030, 2040, eventually, so that we are able to monitor that progress. Again, we do reporting, sustainable reporting, by a totally independent party, so that we are able to move away from, just talking about it. And what we've done is also try and infuse that within the corporates that, we are working with. The Nairobi Securities Exchange has sort of now set out certain reporting guidelines for listed companies, making it compulsory. So we're seeing a number of companies, some of whom we've met here, who are saying, look, we'd like to see what you are doing. What are some of the things we're doing? One of our biggest emissions is from diesel generators, for base stations. So what we are doing is, taking more money out of CAPEX, which, ideally we wouldn't need to do, get rid of those diesel generators, replace them with solar panels. But we also work with partners, contractors who do this for us. So we've had to tell sort of the next level down we need you to style up as well. Those contractors typically say would have a contract to maintain and follow up on our diesel generators, make sure our base stations are running. So we're trying to tell them, you can still have a job to do by getting retrained, reskilled in managing solar. So, let's get rid of that, but not getting rid of our relationships, because we want them to also work smart so that they can partner with us in that sense. So I think there's quite a bit that we have decided we're taking the challenge, so the bull by the horns, if you like, to make sure that we can get to that carbon neutral target. And as a telco, obviously we pollute quite a bit. We're also doing quite a bit of tree planting. We have a target to plant trees to sort of offset the carbon that we're still contributing to the environment. And that's something we're partnering with the private sector, the public sector. We're trying to get our governments as well to sort of set out those key policies that will sort of push the envelope and in a sense move it from voluntary to sort of compulsory. So regulatory discussions are really key around that. So I'll sort of leave it at that for now.
Kip, there's so much in that response. I feel like we need to write your case study and then read it over again. And really what it sounds like is a microcosm, in fact, of the challenge we're facing in South Africa. What you're doing is effectively the just transition. You're looking in the supply chain, you're reskilling, moving people from one area of employment into, getting them ready for a different technology, from moving from diesel to solar. And that's fantastic. And it's great. Can I quickly ask, what has the response been from the communities within which you operate?
Very nice question. So one of the things, our vision is to become a purpose-led company. And that for us is transforming lives. And so the purpose is not just in the sustainability journey, but it's going even to the commercial side of the business and saying the products that we innovate ought to have a purpose to transform lives. You probably have heard of M-Pesa. That was one of the more transformational products that has moved people who weren't included, financially included in the system, into a place where we have billions of transactions, and that's been scaled across countries in Africa. So what we do is to say purpose must infuse in what we do, not just on the sustainable business side, but on the commercial side. So we work with communities right now, again, because of climate change, we're having drought. And that's causing a lot of heartache for the country. So partnering with communities in the regions where there's quite a bit of drought, and we had a market input just not too long ago where, in addition to going to support them around drought, they wanted to know about where they could register their lines. Did you come, with our market people? So we've realized that when you impact the community through purpose, inventing to meet a social need, not inventing just for the sake of profits. And we make it clear that it's about purpose, it's about our people, and then profits is somewhere down the line. And that resonates with our people, with our communities quite well. So, that also helps the brand. So it's a positive spin.
This is a social license to operate conversation. And I think moving on from the very exciting case study to the other necessary area, which I think is looking at standards. And we have Ligia here from the SBTI. And Ligia, of course, being based in Brazil. Oh, I was supposed to walk up there. Being based in Brazil, I think, very, very relevant challenges, I think, to some of us sitting in the room here. And if you could give us a sense of that and, your lead for setting targets in Latin America, what are the challenges that you're seeing that companies in the global south are facing in setting their targets? Very relevant conversation. Many of us in the room either thinking about it or will soon be thinking about setting that and probably going to be facing similar challenges. So if you could share that with that, please, and maybe a little bit about, is SBTI doing anything to support companies on that journey, understanding that there is a difference?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question and for the invite to be here. And also for you to know, I'm here with my colleague Nate, that also works for the SBTI. So we can share here the question. But yeah, we have several specific issues with companies in the global south. And I think that one of them is that here we are talking about multinationals and companies that are very huge, operating in several countries. But when we look for the national companies, most of them sometimes don't even have JG inventories for scopes 1 and 2. And when we think of 3, it's even more challenging. So we definitely need to support them to develop their inventories and to understand how to engage their suppliers, because definitely this is a collective work that we all need to do. Most of these companies also need to engage maybe their high-level board in what is important to set a science-based targets. what do I need to reduce my emissions in this such ambitious way when my competitor is not doing their part. So, and also engage their internal areas, because we need to engage the operations, the human resources, and all of the other areas in order to have a science-based targets. So definitely that is an internal engagement process that we have to go through. And we have the national challenges as well. So not having the financial flows driven to the global south. So as the colleague said, most of the financial institutions that are driving the adoption are in Europe, now in the US. For instance, in Latin America, we only have 3 financial institutions committed to set targets. So we definitely need to grow our numbers in the regions and in the global south as a whole. And we also need governments to support companies and boost the ambition. So a couple of years ago, we had a very good case with Japan, the government of Japan. So they invited Japanese companies to set targets, and they invested money in supporting them. And now Japan, I think it is the second country in level in numbers of companies with approved targets. So it worked very well. It can be a successful case. That's what we need. And what we are doing in the initiative to support companies is we are trying to engage partners at the country level so that they can engage companies because they know their context. So it started with me and my colleague Nico that works for South Africa. So having someone based in these regions, someone that can understand their context. But more than that, we are a very small team in the science-based targets. We are like 50 people to work for the whole world. So we need more than 1 people in the ground. And now we are working with partners. So we are a coalition of 4 institutions, the UN Global Compact, CDP, WRI, and WWF. And we are training them to support companies in the country level. So last year, we performed the first SBTi Train the Trainers, in which we trained almost 200 partners in the country levels from 25 countries in English, in Spanish, and in their languages to understand better what we are doing. And we will try to keep on this work going. We are developing case study, translating our materials, because translation is also a question. So we know this is a very important barrier. We are translating them into Spanish, Portuguese, and other languages. So we know we have a long way to go, but we are trying.
Thank you so much for that, Ligia. Good to know, but it seems like there are challenges abound. And Natalia, maybe I can move to you for a second to share some your perspectives on what you're seeing happening. And I think, interested, just listening to what you're saying, are you anticipating a bottleneck in, applications for accreditation, and what's that looking like? Also, I'm just thinking, if we're thinking, for example, IWSB is coming up soon, and the moment we're moving to regimes in that regard, you're likely to see a massive increase. And your take on that, and maybe, some perspectives for emerging markets.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And, I want to commend all the leading companies here that have set science-based targets. You're definitely the global leaders. I think it's a good problem to have that we're having very rapid demand growth. So we've doubled in size in the past year. We've doubled the number of SBTs among companies and financial institutions. We anticipate continued exponential growth. So that's good, but we will eventually become a bottleneck because SBTi cannot grow that fast. And so we do want more strategic partnerships with people in this circle and others. So for example, IFC is one that we've talked with previously, World Benchmarking Alliance, happy to work with them. I think that we see the SBT initiative being a bit of a standard setter, and then this being implemented across a broader spectrum eventually. One precedent here is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which WRI and WBCSD developed 20 years ago. And that was sort of let go and implemented by consultants all over the world to enable scaling. So we're considering different scaling mechanisms here. But I think for some of the work, we're not quite there yet in terms of having it be fully baked enough to be implemented on a third-party basis. And so we're really trying to prioritize among the different sectors and geographies where there's a need for additional sector guidance. Within the financial sector, I'd say that generally we are now where we were with companies, leading companies, about 5 years ago.
in the sense that most financial institutions don't have emissions data. They're used to dealing with financial data. And so just getting them to think in this sort of orthogonal, metric of emissions impacts of their investment and lending activities is still very new. And so we're building that practice, we're building those resources. Schroders is an excellent example of a leading financial institution that's really setting the precedent for their peers. And the way this works is that all of the companies and financial institutions, you are the messengers. I mean, we can talk all day in SBTI or even policymakers, but what makes a difference is the companies and financial institutions that really take action. You have a very credible and authentic voice that really drives action here. So we're here to support you. And so, our platform, as Lijia mentioned, has been picked up in some countries, for example, Japan, as sort of a turnkey climate solution for a light touch climate policy. But, yesterday's UN Secretary General report, one of the major recommendations there is that governments really step up and provide more regulation and policy push here. And SBTI is obviously a major reference for all of that work. And so that's an incentive for the companies and financial institutions to participate, because then you're at the table and you are defining global best practice that will inform these regulations in your countries. So it's really an opportunity to define the future and to shine a path for where we want to go.
Thanks, Nate. I think very useful there for us to think about the fact we're at a point where we can actually define what's going to happen rather than be takers of it in many instances. So helpful for that. Thank you. Also, I'm South African. All I heard was make the circle bigger. But thank you for that, Nate. I'm going to move on from a slightly different perspective, but from standards to auditing. And Lulu, we have here Lulu from PwC. Lulu, listed and non-listed businesses both being held accountable. What is your perspective? What are you seeing starting to emerge from an audit perspective? Because obviously it's one thing to set standards, another thing to get credibility. We have a whole increase in concerns around greenwashing. And what's your view as that? And have you set your own targets?
Yeah, we have. So I can proudly say that PwC has also set our science-based targets, and it's I think often people don't necessarily understand how it's a network of firms, but what has happened is that from a global perspective, each of our member firms have certain targets that we need to achieve, and if we don't achieve that, we're not allowed to be part of a network anymore. So we can physically lose our registration as PwC member firm. So it's really, really important for us to make that work. But to get to your point, we had a conference last week with the family-owned businesses in Africa. We have a team that deal with family-owned businesses. It's not only the registered the listed entities. And obviously the question came up and said, there's not the same pressures maybe on somebody that's not listed or a family-owned business or something that there would be on a listed entity. And we actually disagreed with him because I think the pressures are coming from very different areas. You're looking at investors, you're looking at consumers, communities, everybody that is getting involved. And that is actually, I think, putting a lot more pressure on companies to say, well, even if I'm not required by regulation to do certain things, the community in which I operate, the stakeholders, my own employees. An interesting one that I've heard from our talent teams that are quite involved in helping our clients recruit the right talent is one of the very big questions that they're getting now from people applying for jobs is, what are you doing? Do you have science-based targets? What are you doing for the communities where you operate? Which actually brings me onto another point. Yes, we have standards. Yes, from an audit perspective, I know that my colleagues that is on the assurance side of the business, they are really trying to figure all this out and help our clients identify what is material, what is important to them, and what their shareholders and their stakeholders would want to hear. But there's one thing that I picked up over the last couple of interactions that we've had with clients, and that is the need for cultural change in organizations to make this real. We can come up with all kinds of from senior leadership. We spoke about buy-in from senior leadership. That's absolutely crucial. And I think most companies are there, but where things seem to become difficult is in terms of making this real in the rest of the business, because there's still the perception that there's a group of people that's dealing with this. It's not my problem. And it's about making sure that the rest of the business understands, what role they play. And you spoke earlier about HR and, and data and everybody that's involved in the process, and that it's not just one person's problem. So that need for cultural change in organizations to make this real is something that I think that we've seen a lot. We've engaged with clients, we've helped them, it's these exciting projects, we're going to help you, and then you hit a wall. And then you realize it's because we don't have everybody on board yet, everybody don't understand the inputs, and we actually need to help them along that journey as well.
Goodness, PwC as a culture shift agent, I've definitely seen it all now. but that's really, really interesting. And I think so many nodding heads around the room suggest that we're having the same experience, right? That within organizations is not that easy to get that on the table. And maybe a little bit more. So you've touched on that, looking at the culture shift element. Would that be your traditional space to help with? Like, how would you help the clients in this regard?
Yeah, so I think, I've worked in this space for the last 15 years. And when I joined the audit profession, everybody was saying to me, what are you going to do there? And I think there's a perception that is what we do, but there's so much more. And, where we get involved with organizations, literally in every single area of their business. Of course, there's very specific criteria in terms of independence that we need to follow and that we do follow. That's very, very important to us. But I think the important thing is, understanding, getting, whether it's, a consulting firm or whoever it is, understanding that it's not just something that you're going to plonk into an organization. There's certain things that needs to happen. Right from setting the KPIs to the reporting to, the auditing to getting the right data. And it's understanding that value chain and actually helping companies to, for companies to understand that and actually then achieving it that way.
Sounds like a tall order, but a necessary one. Thank you so much, Lulu, for that. Shifting gears slightly, I think maybe a bit of a global lender perspective. Anup, I'm going to move to you. Anup's from the IFC. And what is the role that you're seeing for the IFC, and what do you think is needed to enable access? In some instances, maybe to discount capital for decarbonization, debt facilities, things like that. What are you seeing? What are the needs, particularly with this kind of North-South need that we're seeing developing quite rapidly now?
Thank you. And pleased to be here. So, I kick off with a question. We committed to Paris alignment some time back to align all our investments with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we have a framework with the other MDBs, which has essentially two tracks that we're going to look at each transaction from a mitigation lens and a risk and resilience lens. So we're going to look at every transaction that we invest in. Is it the least GHG emitting pathway for the project? And does it take into account climate risk when they build that business, right? So it's a pretty heavy task because we look at every project globally across the world like that. And when we started training staff, and to your point earlier, we said we need to get everybody engaged in the process. There's not going to be just a small climate team that does this. Every investment officer needs to be trained in this thing. And when we started Paris Alignment, one of the most confusing messages we gave to people was a project may be aligned in one country, but not in another. And they scratched their heads. Why? Because, country circumstances are different. Where they are operating from is different. And so the big thing we've had to do is finance is, of course, a barrier. To your question, finance is definitely a barrier. But what we're finding more than that is capacity. When you ask a client to do something, so if you ask one of your investing companies, hey, get on this target or make your business more climate resilient, they'll be scratching their heads. Where do I start? How do I go about it? Right? Yes, there are some tools, SBTi and others around, but there's still lots of gaps out there. And that's what we're trying to bridge. So we run a lot of capacity building programs, training for banks. I mean, we have a program, for example, in green bonds. We've been training cohorts of bankers from emerging markets on green bonds, but not just the whole process, but how do you even identify assets that are green in your book and then grow those assets further. We've been working on tools. So tools for whether it's GHG accounting, the starting point for a company, or looking at climate risk. So we have to approach it from different angles. And finally, the climate piece, what we've got is, we've got blended finance, of course, but if we apply it, we're very rigorous about where we apply it. So far, we've seen that it's only needed in certain circumstances, right? Either a business fundamentally makes sense or not. I think somebody described it as, there's a small subset. So there's bankable on this side on this line and not bankable below that. And in between is a small dotted line that says, okay, these can be bankable and you've got to push them over the edge. And for me, so you need to figure out if that's the case and then support those projects accordingly. And then that's what we're looking to do. And finally, mobilization is a big part for us. So when we're investing in these projects, we've got a lot of other institutional investors going in with us. So we, when we did our Paris alignment thing, some of the institutional investors in Europe said, hey, you're doing this, here's $500 million of our money. So every time you put in $1, add 25 cents from this pool and invest this 500 million for us, right? So we're doing a lot of that. But when I go back, I think capacity building, knowledge are some of the key gaps in this process.
Thanks, Anup. Can I make your life slightly difficult? You talked about the bankable and non-bankable. Is there not a space in between, particularly for markets like ours, that is not bankable but necessary in a transition? And whose role is that?
Yeah, there are places like that, and this is where I think the public sector has an important role to play, right? And I give you the example of some time back we started this scaling solar program, and we realized that sure we can finance a solar project in a country, the IPP, but often the off-taker, which is the government, may not be strong enough. So then we partnered with the bank, and often the regulation is not there to bring that in. So we partnered with our sister institution on the bank side and brought the public sector in for two things: to help with the regulatory part and also to provide a guarantee from the to make the off-taker strong. So then you can attract private sector players. So you're absolutely right. As we go about making this happen, do people want to come in South Africa and set up a solar plant? What is the state of the utility that's going to buy it? Is it bankable? Is it going to be able to make that offtake commitment? So there is a role for the public sector in bridging that gap. Some of the capacity building I talked about, the public sector is doing that. The public sector is funding that capacity building, helping us deliver on that. So there is significant role for other types of capital here.
Thank you, Anup. Sorry to make your life difficult. I'm going to move to Avana. So Avana is with Nedbank. And Nedbank is obviously one of the big banks in South Africa, quite a large presence. And you're known as the Green Bank. I think people probably know you as a Green Bank before they know you as Nedbank. But maybe a little bit on there, what are the trends that you're observing broadly in the finance space? And particularly innovation, I think, that we're seeing starting to develop in finance. And what does that look like?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Shabila. Yeah, maybe just to contribute to the conversation, I think, as we said, Nedbank being the Green Bank, maybe to start there, we have been very purpose-led, so really guided by our purpose to use our financial expertise to do good. And sustainability is something that we embrace throughout, so through our CSI initiatives, as well as our operations, and in our mainstream financing activities. Now, mainstream financing activities particularly, that's our biggest lever that we can pull as a bank to create impact and scale, and hence the need to drive our financing activity in that direction. So this has been evidenced by us taking that lead in terms of the renewable energy financing program and being a large financier there, and really then starting to unlock in the embedded generation space and providing alternative solutions to actually bank that sector of the market. And more recently, really drive the development of green loans, green bonds, and sustainability linked loans in the market. And some of the innovative structures that we've put in place there is that combination of blending alternative sources of financing, whether that's through impact investors alongside the commercial banks and DFIs, and arranging a financing package there and bringing those sources of capital together to ultimately bring in tenor, price tension, as well as a diverse order book. I think on the lending side as well, it's really about staying close to our clients on their journeys. We have clients on various spaces in their journey, some who have set net zero commitments and some who have not yet set net zero commitments. So we play quite a big role there in terms of driving awareness of the sustainable finance market and how that's developing in terms of financing tools that have come across to support it, but also on their sustainability journeys, where's the room to actually stretch that a bit further from environmental, social, governance perspective to actually make that bankable and to actually be able to engage in this market. And I think also importantly, it's around, how do we manage the just and the transitional elements of that? So whilst we have set a net zero 2050 commitment as a bank, we started off with a glide path on our fossil fuel book. And ultimately from there, we'll then continue to develop other sectoral glide paths, but really trying to ensure we remain just and inclusive. And also locally knowing that we've got the Just Transition Framework that has been launched by the government, as well as the Climate Change Bill, which I think will really guide the market in South Africa in terms of setting sectoral carbon budgets.
Absolutely. And Ravana, you had a very interesting way of blending finance recently that had value right back to retail customers, as well as spurred actually development into low carbon buildings and the like. Maybe tell us a little bit about that, because that was quite innovative and I think really answered to many local needs.
Sure, and I think that was something we highlighted earlier on in the discussion, but what basically that entailed was around identifying a gap. And one of the gaps we saw was that there is green affordable housing that's necessary in the market. And by able to incentivize developers to actually go green, there's also the ability then to effectively shield your customers from inflationary increases, and that leaves more income, which can be channeled back into the economy for further growth. So using sustainable growth as our departing point of the objective that we want to achieve, we then almost work backwards to say, which are the key players in this ecosystem that we can bring together to make this actually a reality. And one of the market barriers of going green is that it is costly. So by being able to mobilize that particular money from UK donor money to actually cover the cost of going green for some of our clients, that basically incentivizes them to go green, then providing them with the finance as well as providing them with the training as to how to actually go about designing a green building and getting that certified by partnering with the likes of the Excellence in Design and Green Efficiencies program.
Thanks, Ravana. I think very good demonstration of going far further than you normally would have as a bank, but because of the intent and the starting point of wanting to enable sustainable development. I think, well, thank you for that. It's a useful example. Moving on a little bit to looking at sort of a grouping around industry partners and NGOs. Adriana, let me start with you. The Global Alliance for Banking on Values. Okay, from one bank to another. Well, banking on values. Any learnings from your work with banks and financial institutions that are part of your alliance? And practical financial instruments that you might want to share with us that you've observed that have been developed in financing the transition.
Yes. Well, first of all, the Global Alliance has 70 banks around the world. And so we have about 6 members in Africa, 13 in Latin America, in East Asia, in Asia in general, we have about 18. So overall, it's quite diverse geographic distribution, and the intention really is to bring together what we refer to as front runners in sustainability. That means that these institutions have and are there for a particular purpose. Typically, it might mean that there is a gap, a need that they are serving. It can be questions around inclusion, but it could be also a matter of sustainability. Sustainability is not an absolute term. It's a real continuum. And we have heard today a number of presentations around what is our efforts to integrate considerations of climate impact of financing decisions of banks. So what we do, and the experience of the BEMBAs, is this alliance of banks, very small, some of them, microfinance institutions, retail banks, commercial banks, and cooperatives, so very diverse as well. We're very instrumental in the globalization of what is now known as the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. And what that means is that in 2019, they decided that they were going to measure and disclose their financed emissions. The need to actually understand what was their climate impact. It was very important because the methodology was not necessarily tailored for these kinds of institutions. And it required also the recognition that perhaps it was not going to be a perfect exercise, but it was a necessary exercise. As a result, these institutions have been evolving to, after incorporating this information, because already they have very strict exclusion lists. So they don't finance fossil fuels. They don't finance most of them. It depends because it's global. So it's very context specific. But some of them are very strict in their exclusion list. In general terms, it's about doing good and avoiding harm. So what they have done, and I think this is very important, is when you have information on your climate impact, there's a lot that you can do. You can set targets. You can set your portfolio pathways, but you can also evolve your business. And we have examples of institutions that have developed impact appetite frameworks that the board monitors. We've heard a lot about culture. It has to be a holistic approach. But there also we have some of our members who have developed tools that allow for the probability of default to be factored in considering climate impacts, and that to be reflected on the interest rate to be charged differentially to clients. What that does, it creates, again, an ecosystem of values integration. It's looking to work together with clients. It's not just about engaging clients, but it's really to recognize that it's a partnership and that the benefits of this transition are to be shared. And therefore then comes innovation in a number of ways, including apps that gives the members or the clients information on the carbon dioxide, sustainability reporting in some of the instances for SMEs. So it is really reaching out and filling gaps of information and understanding for SMEs who actually do not really often know what the impacts are. So it is, I would say, in some ways, redefining the barrier, the frontier of sustainability that has been the result of this approach to banking from the beginnings of let's just measure financed emissions. Okay, what does that and where? How far can we go and how fast?
Thank you, Adriana. I'm listening to a subtext there that's also culture change.
It is a fundamental culture change. It's very integrated, and it must be said, it's not an easy journey, even for organizations that are purpose-driven organizations from the beginning. It's not that they might even have it easier because they were already very positively impactful. But if you think about already for them to convince their colleagues internally that perhaps they need to now start looking whenever they are going to decide or not to finance a project, not just at the traditional, is this the area where I want to create a positive impact, but is there enough water there for me to actually finance that project? Is there enough, am I exacerbating, am I off 1.5 degree, and have client-facing workers recognize that that is a necessary step. It requires also internal dialogue and internal conviction that this is the path ahead. So it's always an effort for all institutions in this sector, I think.
And educating around impact and outcome.
And the clients themselves as well.
Thank you very much, Adriana. I appreciate that. And so just to round up today, I think we're slightly over time. I'm not sure. And we want to have a little bit of view from some consulting space, working with multiple companies. And maybe I can start with Patrick. If you could give us a view from South Pole, you're sort of enabling companies to develop their decarbonization pathways, and how much of your current work of businesses in the global South, and maybe give us a quick view of what you're experiencing, perhaps even in contrast to the North.
Yeah. Before I start, just to give you a bit of context about South Pole for those of you that don't know, so we are a global solutions provider fully dedicated to climate change. We work on what we call the climate journey. So starting with measuring emissions and risks, target setting, and then helping companies to tackle those targets. Fun fact about South Pole, the name South refers to the global South, because when we started as a company, we started actually in the Kyoto Protocol as a project developer under the Clean Development Mechanism. So our purpose as a company at that day was to support projects in the global South. So, and also another fun fact about me, I have a very Swiss name, but I'm Brazilian. So, and as a co-founder, the vision was always to make Brazil look a little bit more like Germany, where I lived as a teenager. So, so that has always been our purpose all along, to drive change in the global South through sustainable development. And we are active on advisory. So we have about 1,200 staff now. Half of them are consultants helping companies along their climate journey. And the other half of the company is dedicated to environmental markets. So renewable energy certificates, carbon credits, and those things. The carbon credit part of the business is very much focused on the global South. But interestingly now, where we started with advisory mainly in the global North, but now we see more and more demand in the global South. And also many companies in the global South kind of leapfrogging and doing, I think, even a better job than many in the global North. And this is, I think, what we need to realize. It's not only a burden or a pain to go through net zero, it's the biggest transformation that humanity has ever done, right? Much bigger than the agricultural revolutions we did or the industrial revolutions. So I think we also have to think of it as an opportunity and try to embrace, how a company can contribute to being a part of the solution and not a part of the problem, right? And that can trigger, I think, a lot of opportunity. And that's what we would like to pivot towards, to help companies transition towards that direction. So.
Thank you, Patrick. And on that note, I want to maybe move to Katja from South Pole. Katja, we didn't leave, last but not least, absolutely, to give us some of your perspective from Guidehouse, on what you're observing, maybe just a quick view on what Guidehouse does. And then I want to really touch on the best practices that you might be seeing emerging, particularly in relation to the South and how that's working for those that are making it work, considering cost constraints, regulatory barriers, non-existence of regulation and the like.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, Guidehouse is an international consultancy, you can say. And the fun part is we work with private and public sector, and we really it's about implementation. And well, there's a lot to talk about. Maybe I can provide one example where we work with the private sector, because we heard a lot about the journey and what's happening and who's providing leadership. There's something that was set up. It's called the SLOC, the Supplier Leadership. Well, now I break up the name. Supplier Leadership on Climate Transition. That's what it is. SLOC, it's a crazy name, but it's really important because it was set up by PepsiCo, Mars, and McCormick with Guidehouse together 5 years ago. And what was the idea? Well, everybody saw, we heard it at the very opening, is that, well, it's difficult to deal with the greenhouse gas protocol with SBTi if you're alone in your company and you're asked, okay, now you need to do it. Specifically, if you hear from some of the larger brands or from somebody, well, now you need to do it. So it was here the idea that the brands came together and said, we want to support this by engaging with the suppliers, but not everybody alone, and not that everybody just has one consultant dealing with it, but that set up a joint program. So that program is now in its fourth year, and it has over 500 suppliers engaged in over 50 countries of the world. And the new thing, the unique part about it is that the brands came together and saw, what do we need together with the suppliers? And it turned into, you could say, 3 secret ingredients. One of which is like, you have really somebody with you, like human talking, maybe online, even during COVID, but somebody explaining it. So it's not just an online course, but it's with somebody. The second is a 24/7 help desk. And I think that's really critical, because if you get stuck with your SBTi or something else, you want to answer that question now and not in 4 weeks when you may have forgotten or something else. So that's the second part. And the third part is really trying to make a little bit fun of the more dry topics that not, I mean, I know some people love it, but it's not for everybody. So it's really to look at these and disentangle it and bring also the collaboration, because the nice thing is that it's the suppliers, and we heard that before, what's in the South, to have them at the same table, even if somebody's from packaging, somebody's from supplying vanilla from orchids. So it's very different type of supplies, but some of the challenges are the same, specifically when you see how you engage with the community. And I think that's back the link what we heard before when it comes to a just transition. And yes, there's many more suppliers than the 500 that are there, but that's just the beginning. It's been doubling, and it's also not just stopping at setting the targets, that's what you all said, but it's also driving it all the way to disclose. Plus, also, I think, yes, it's important to do the monitoring and have everything with a name, but also by having the leaders engage, you're raising the bar. So you will even have an impact without having an auditor come and do it. And I think that's what I believe in. We cannot wait until we have everybody there, but we need to raise the bar that it just becomes the standard of that. And I think that's a little bit on the brand side. The other part, when we look at the public sector, it's also about transition. One program, and then you see that here, it's called CoolUp. It's actually a German government supported program where we work on the transition of sustainable cooling. And that's where we work together. It's private sector, public sector, and finance, where it's really changing and transforming a sector. And that's here about, and maybe you've heard about it, air conditioning and refrigeration. They all still use refrigerants. It's a very techie thing. It's a heavy industry, but it can be done with sustainable solutions. And that really is a transformational shift. And what we see there, the joint partnerships involving then also the local manufacturers, that's really something where that's important. And that's what excites me about it, bringing people together. We just had the first regional conference in Turkey, bringing all 4, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. Actually, that's the 4 partner countries, bringing them together from all the 3 industries. And that's been really amazing to enable the dialogue. And I think that's what I really love about this roundtable today, that it enables the dialogue. And I'm sure there will be more conversations to come after this.
Thank you so much, Katja. I think the takeaway there for me was really about the last bit, in fact, about the collaboration, at least starting that conversation. I think up to now, we've seen, typically because of the way business models grow, your effort is focused on yourself. But the change that we need globally is never going to happen doing it on your own. And so the sectoral level collaboration potentially is going to be absolutely important. I mean, if we're talking about, you're talking about packaging and recycling initiatives, you're very unlikely to get that up and running completely on your own and scalable and economically feasible. But if you did it with a few other people in the industry, and that's a common good that you're developing, is potentially a much different conversation. And that could possibly yield bigger community benefits as well. So I think that's it. Thank you for that, Katja. Very helpful. Vicky, I'm gonna turn to you because you've been all over the world looking at all sorts of different things. Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, but importantly, the trends you're seeing developing. Anything particular, north, south, and understanding that there's a different pathway, I guess, for the south. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the question. And we definitely encourage SBTI to have more sectoral decarbonization paths, because we indeed, when we look at a sectoral decarbonization, we look at where is the company placed. We make a difference. Where you're an electric utility company in Europe, you have a different pathway than when you're an electric utility company in Asia. So we make that difference, and we show the difference there in the results. So we benchmark, we assess, and we actually look at, have the company set the relevant targets, and are they also performing against those targets? Because we're talking about greenwashing, and I think target setting is definitely the first step, but it also sometimes creates the illusion of progress, and we need to measure whether companies are actually really performing against those targets. And I think the topic of today is definitely making it just and fair. So I hear a lot about decarbonization, and I think it's definitely the right thing to do, but we also need to make sure that it is done in a just and equitable way, hence that it's including social dialogue with the ones impacted, and it is really setting a just transition plan that is associated with the decarbonization plan. And I think you're asking the difference between the different regions. We've actually just looked at the transport sector, and we actually see that quite a few companies who are based in developing countries
are actually already addressing quite a lot of these social challenges that they're seeing. So they are more transparent around how are they really going in, entering into the social dialogue and really being transparent around it, because we really need to, if we want to hold companies to account, it's not for the companies to solve them it all by themselves, but we need them to be very transparent about what is the impact of their plans, because that only you can have cross-sectoral cooperation as well to really address the challenges ahead. Because when jobs disappear in one sector, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily being replaced by jobs, and it needs to be have place-based solutions. So we need to work, we look at sectoral decarbonization, but cross-sectoral cooperation when we address the just issue.
Thank you so much, Vicky. And a nice note, I think, to end today, to firstly, a resounding thank you to all our panelists. I know it's the end of a long day on Finance Day, and you've stayed with us through it out. Very, very grateful for that, but I'm hoping some useful perspectives shared for all of us and for the audience on the line, and the start of what's hopefully many more conversations, Pragya. So thank you to everybody. I think we're hearing that the innovation is there, the opportunity for innovation is there, the challenges are certainly there, but there are good case studies for how they can be overcome, and intent is critical. And then, of course, SDG 17, partnerships for the goals, where that's it. So thank you very much to NASPERS Prosus for convening this. Very grateful, and I wish you all a lovely afternoon. Thank you to our panelists. We have a group photo.